Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post. This week, caged in Cairo, 3 Al Jazeera employees are found guilty. According to their colleagues all around the news industry, the crime they committed is called journalism. The biggest conviction yet in the phone hacking scandal, but Rupert Murdoch's British tabloid spins the story the other way. And bait and click, those online headlines you just cannot resist. Last year, every time we covered the media story in Egypt, we would contact our producer in Cairo. He would advise us on logistics, security, and help ensure we got the story right. But Mohammed Fahmy was not available this week. An Egyptian court sentenced him and his colleagues, Peter Gresta and Bahir Mohammed, to between 7 and 10 years in prison for, quote, spreading false news and aiding or joining the banned Muslim Brotherhood. The sentences provoked condemnation from Al Jazeera and news organizations elsewhere. Some of the prosecution's evidence was so flimsy it might have been funny if the consequences were not so serious. But in Egypt, some mainstream media outlets applauded the verdict, echoing a wider view of Al Jazeera, a network that was such a big part of the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square, but that later fell from grace in the eyes of some over a perceived bias in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood. The crackdown on press freedom has paralleled a larger security operation to quell dissent. Hundreds have disappeared, some 40,000 Egyptians have been arrested. And those are the kinds of stories that risk going untold, with journalists in Egypt either parroting the government's national security narrative or facing the consequences. Our starting point this week is Cairo. June 23rd was the 177th day the 3 journalists from Al Jazeera English had spent either jailed in a prison or caged in a courtroom. They and the families there to support them hoped it was the last. The judge sentenced them to another 7 years, and in one case, 10 years.
They say that an image is worth 1,000 words. When you see journalists being dragged from a cage into his jail sentence, and you see the Egyptian police forcing the cameras to shut down. This is an indication of how the Egyptian authority is treating the media. But also shows how low the Egyptian government is willing to go in order to silence the media.
The screams, which were the families of those defendants, it was actually the sound of pain. I just felt this incredible amount of shame, ashamed to be Egyptian. I couldn't look Peter in the face because Egypt had failed him and failed all of them and failed me. And it's very difficult to feel shame for being Egyptian, and I'd never felt it before, but I feel it now because it's just disgraceful what this country's done to them.
Real justice, it is said, must not only be done, but seen to be done. This is how Egyptian justice was seen in the case of the Al Jazeera 3. Human Rights Watch said in today's Egypt, simply practicing professional journalism is a crime. Reporters Without Borders said, not content with criminalizing political opposition, the Egyptian authorities are pursuing a policy of gagging news media. Amnesty International called it a dark day for press freedom and said the convictions were based on not a single shred of solid evidence. As the Huffington Post reported it, the prosecution repeatedly presented evidence taken from the journalists' laptops that appeared to have nothing to do with the case, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Jazeera, and in many instances, Egypt itself.
If anything, the way evidence was used made those trials look like a kind of kangaroo court. There were evidence of videos not produced by the journalists who were being accused. There were videos from other news channels where the journalists don't work. There were pictures of goats, there was music videos, there was all sorts of digital artifacts that were unrelated to the production team that was being accused.
They didn't care to show evidence. As Jon Stewart showed in his segment how even this evidence is such a sham that you should have created better evidence.
A sham so shammy, Egypt's prosecution couldn't be bothered to even pretend it wasn't a sham. Their case is based on some random video clip they probably found on the web.
You would think the Egyptian state would want to have a good name as a purveyor of freedom of press and such. It didn't seem to care, but the farce even communicates something of, well, I can even use this and get away with it. and exercise power.
We're going to turn to our CNN correspondent, Ian Lee.
In an extraordinary act of media solidarity, CNN made its correspondents available to Al Jazeera on this story. Egypt's domestic media would not or could not do the same. Egyptian journalism came a long way in the years leading up to and culminating in the 2011 revolution. They have since given that ground back to the government and adopted the national security narrative almost wholesale, particularly on the television side. And the poster child for that turnaround is Ibrahim Issa, a journalist once jailed by the Mubarak regime. Compare what he said about Al Jazeera in 2011, when it was still the toast of Tahrir Square, to what he says today.
وهم اللي بيشتغلوا في الجزيرة صحفيين أو إعلاميين ولا الجزيرة كما هو واضح ده شؤون معنوية العدو. مفيش حياد بين الطغيان وبين الحرية. بالضبط قناة الجزيرة والعاملين فيها زي أي موقع لداعش على الإنترنت أو لتنظيم القاعدة.
It was a disgraceful turnaround by Ibrahim Issa. For this very journalist, specifically him, after what he said about Al Jazeera, praising Al Jazeera in the past, and also for being in prison for falsifying news, the same exact charge, to then essentially feed these journalists to the wolves, which is what he did in his show that night, telling people these are not journalists. He really feeding on all of these fears. He fed on all of that, and he sold out these journalists.
I also have seen comments from other journalists. We've seen a lot of them lose their principal position and become partisan.
وهذه عقوبة عادلة لمن يخون وطنه أو لمن يقتل نفسا بغير حق.
Which in itself may not be a problem, but when it's starting to justify oppression and starting to give the government ammunition to use against other journalists, that's I think would be the greatest loss.
This story is bigger than a squabble between a news outlet and a government. Those happen all the time. This is government on government. Qatar, which owns Al Jazeera and is seen as providing support to the Muslim Brotherhood, versus Egypt, which banned the movement that just over 1 year ago was the country's democratically elected government.
Any state managing its relation with foreign media is always a reflection of the relation of the state towards other regional and international players. This will give Sisi maybe 6 years ahead of him to always have this bargaining chip with these journalists. So I think there will be a lot of international playing between the United States, between Al Jazeera as an institution of journalism, and also the state of Qatar itself and the Egyptian state.
These trials have implications around the region because since the Arab Spring, several kinds of governments have figured out new ways of cracking down on journalists. In particular, Turkey, over the last year, has successfully prosecuted several journalists for their tweets, and it's pretty clear that some regimes are being allowed to get away with this, getting away with putting journalists into jail for things that they didn't really do.
And for the moment, Egypt is getting away with it. The U.S. Secretary of State did call the court's verdict chilling and draconian. But money talks. A diplomatic slap on the wrist walks. And President el-Sisi can live with the criticism from one side of Washington's mouth as long as the other side has just delivered $572 million in military aid to a man fresh out of uniform.
This was never just about 3 journalists. This was never just about Al Jazeera. It's about the thousands of people that are now in prison for expressing their opinion.
Imagine a world where journalism is silenced.
And it's not just about criticizing, it's actually now about praising. You have to praise in order to be allowed to work.
And they're all trying to jam and get in.
The foreign media right now are really pretty much the only media that are criticizing or that are presenting a different narrative. And that is why this verdict sent a very strong message. We want freedom! There was no point in sending a message to the local media. They are already in line. It was sending a message to the foreign media, really, to toe the line, or you can be in that cage and you will be in that cell, and no mercy will be shown.
Our Global Village voices now on the court case, Al Jazeera, and the state of journalism in Egypt.
In Egypt, the recent conviction of 3 Al Jazeera journalists not only instills fear within the journalism community, but within the wider community of dissent. Yet, while the majority of the international community has expressed outrage at the government, the majority in Egypt have been quite supportive of the conviction of the 3 Al Jazeera journalists and of the wider crackdown on those who expressed dissent, such as Bassem Youssef and recently Ala al-Aswani. Only when the majority of Egyptians recognize the crucial role of journalism that press freedom will truly be realized in Egypt.
Those who still believe in the revolution with all its principles, freedom, democracy and dignity, were just very much against this verdict. Others were still saying, yes, finally, the Al Jazeera journalists who were conspiring and plotting against the country has received what they deserve. This tells us that the polarization of the country is still existing. It's a sad case, and hopefully it will be solved peacefully in the future.
We're always looking for new faces for the program. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the news media as one of our Global Village voices, you can get in touch with us on Facebook or just send us a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @AJListeningPost. And don't forget, our free video podcast on iTunes. Just look for the Listening Post, Al Jazeera English, and you'll find us there. Time now for Listening Post NewsBytes. 16 major news organizations have all gone to an American court demanding the release of video footage from the prison at Guantanamo Bay. That footage shows a hunger-striking prisoner being force-fed. The prisoner is a Syrian, Abu Wa'el Diab. He has been held since 2002, has never been charged with a crime, was actually cleared for release back in 2009, but remains behind bars 5 years later. Among the organizations behind the legal case, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, NPR, and Bloomberg. They went before a federal judge in Washington and argued that under the U.S. First Amendment, the American public has the right to know, and in this case see, what is being done in their name in order to exercise their democratic right to judge the actions of their government. Neither the Pentagon nor the Justice Department has commented for the record on the Diab case, but have argued in other Guantanamo cases that videos are classified as secret to protect the anonymity of the military personnel involved and to safeguard security techniques. The Turkish government, which has proven in the recent past that it's not shy when it comes to censoring the media, has banned any reporting on ISIL's kidnapping of 49 people from the Turkish consulate in Mosul. The blackout was imposed June 16th. Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan urged the media not to provoke ISIL with their coverage of the abduction. The court ruling was sought by RTÜK, the Turkish broadcasting regulator, which justified the move as its way of protecting the safety of the hostages. But there's a pattern here. Back in March, embroiled in a corruption scandal, the Erdogan government blocked Twitter and YouTube, saying that social media was being used to destabilize the government. And Erdogan has been blamed by many in Turkey for failing to evacuate the consulate before it was attacked. And with presidential elections set for August, there is a lot to play for in Turkish politics right now. June 24th was Judgment Day for tabloid journalism in the UK. One of Rupert Murdoch's former editors has been found guilty in the phone hacking case, and the fallout has reached all the way to 10 Downing Street and Prime Minister David Cameron. Andy Coulson, the former editor of the News of the World, was convicted, but his predecessor at the paper, Rebecca Brooks, was cleared, along with her husband and her secretary. After leaving the paper under the hacking cloud, Coulson went on to work for Cameron in the Prime Minister's office.
I'm extremely sorry that
Cameron has since apologized for bringing Coulson to number 10, but this episode has left him open to serious questions about his judgment. In all, 6 employees of Murdoch's News International have now gone down, all convicted over phone hacking. The next day's coverage in the British papers was all over the map. The Daily Mail tabloid focused on the political angle and Downing Street. The Murdoch-owned Times trumpeted Brooks's not guilty verdict over Coulson's conviction. Tabloids are called red tops in the UK, and Murdoch's Sun had no shame. It had a triumphant Brooks as its page 1 girl, the usual page 3 girl, but nary a mention of the guilty verdict against Coulson until page 4. If you've been on Facebook today, you'll have seen and maybe even clicked on headlines that seem to pull on your mouse pointer like a magnet. Headlines that twist your arm into clicking on them just to find out what the enticing intro does not tell you. Here's one of our own for you. We produced a feature on clickbait headlines, and you won't believe what we found out. Because the fact is, most, if not all of the online outfits that put clickbait out there don't care if their content disappoints. The point is, You went there. You can't take that click back, and that's what advertisers care about. But as some news outlets have learned at their expense, there are some news stories that web surfers just don't want to be manipulated over. The Listening Post's Will Young now on the epidemic of clickbait and the devious tricks of a growing trade.
Seriously, wow.
69 facts about New Zealand.
21 pictures that will
restore your faith in humanity.
20 things that will blow your mind.
Aren't headlines supposed to tell us what's in a story so you can decide whether to read it? Since when did they start promising to blow your mind?
It's that sort of feeling that it's irresistible and you have to click on it. This is a very typical clickbait headline. A guy took a photo in the dark with flash on. What it captured is terrifying beyond words. It doesn't tell you what at all this is about, but it raises the, gee, terrifying beyond words? What could it possibly be?
So even if you feel kind of cynical about the headline and don't really want to read the story, you are almost going to have to click. There was a headline that was something like, this kid died. What he left behind is one-tacular, like wonderful stuck into spectacular. And you just never find out in the headline what the one-tacular thing is. Headlines used to be more descriptive because they assumed that the reader was kind of there to read news. Now, so you're there not to be bored.
BuzzFeed probably precedes them all. They have the list thing going. I think they own that. Before Upworthy, people weren't really aware of the topic quite as much, but because Upworthy keeps using the headlines in that way, and that's really how they became such an overnight success, that then was mirrored by different sites. I've actually started rebelling against it. Even if it seems interesting, I'm like, no, not going to do it.
So maybe you clicked, but did the content literally blow your mind? Did it restore your faith in humanity? Probably not. We invited BuzzFeed and Upworthy to explain their headline writing policies to us, but they said they'd rather not. We did get the Huffington Post's managing editor on camera, and he says, despite what some readers might think, clickbait isn't part of the website's modus operandi.
We've all gone through the experience on the internet of clicking on something, arriving at a page, and then kind of being disappointed or having it feel a little flat. That, for us, is something we try to avoid at all costs. And I think that's one of the things that may distinguish us from places that are really pushing the limit. One example that comes to mind for me is the headline that we did for the government shutdown. When the government shutdown ended, we wrote the headline, men got us into the shutdown, women got us out. It had that bite to it. It had that humor. It kind of crystallized the moment in the right way. There were probably very few differences between the story that we wrote and the story that Politico wrote and the story that the Journal wrote and the story that the New York Times wrote. But I would, if I had to guess, our headline probably drew more people to our story than theirs did.
And in the end, there's nothing more important than getting those clicks. In the online economy, page views equal advertising revenue. But are any methods justified for any story? In February, CNN tried clickbait tactics on a story about rape statistics. There was a backlash. The headline might have read, CNN tried out a clickbait headline, and the results shocked everybody.
I understand that CNN would want to draw traffic to its article, but I don't think that that's enough of a justification with stories that are really controversial or need more nuance. You know, we're talking about rape here. How in the world can you use that kind of a clickbait headline for that type of a topic?
CNN didn't see it that way. In response to its critics, it posted another tweet. Thanks for feedback. It's genuinely surprising Alaska's rape rate is so high. The story deserves attention. You may or may not agree with them, but what about this tweet from CNN from the previous month? 14-year-old girl stabbed her little sister 40 times, police say. The reason why will shock you.
There are tactics that are okay for some newcomers that probably aren't okay for a CNN. Mainstream media are facing competitors like Upworthy and others that are growing tremendously. And they would be remiss if they didn't notice this and try to figure out how they could use some of these tactics. Now, the problem is mainstream media has legacy brands to protect, and These new outlets like Upworthy don't have that.
In the battle for online eyeballs, media outlets tend to follow the traffic. As BuzzFeed and Upworthy's page view figures have skyrocketed, other websites have copied the clickbait formula. But there's another factor at play here, which is less about the headlines and more about one particular website that's driving a lot of those clicks: Facebook. When the social media giant changed what's known as its newsfeed algorithm last year, that one change channeled all kinds of highly clickable content right there where you're most likely to see it. Suddenly, clickbait was everywhere.
The newsfeed is what you see when you log into Facebook.com. So it's like the main way that Facebook shows you content. The effect of this algorithm change was so enormous that publishers started to kind of target their stories toward Facebook users. And the Upworthy style headline really seems to work well there.
I think that the way that news is now viewed is really heavily influenced by social media and the type of social media that's available. 10 years ago, you didn't have people using Facebook. You didn't have people using Twitter. Now, you share it on Facebook, you share it on Twitter. I think we will definitely experience clickbait fatigue. We're already seeing it. We're going to get tired of those types of headlines. But sites and publications change with the times. So what's clickbait this year is not going to be clickbait next year.
So when you're killing time on the internet and a headline grabs you,
69 facts about New Zealand.
They're literally out of this world.
Will you rise to the clickbait?
More Global Village voices now on the scourge of clickbait.
Clickbaiting is rife online today because it works. That's the simple truth of the matter. But many people feel that clickbaiting is cheapening the journalist's eye. Clickbait is, by design, it's ephemeral, it's fleeting, it's designed to elicit an immediate, almost unthinking response from the reader. It's ultimately not a very comfortable relationship either for the journalist or the reader. In the end, superb content is what really wins, not these sensationalist headlines that are here for the moment and not going to be here for the long run.
With clickbait, we're really talking more about the headline. That formula of X will make you Y, or this thing happened and you won't believe what happened next. This said, if a clickbaity title gets more people reading a great piece, I think that's only a good thing. Though, it can feel a little bit cheap, the deception, the bait part. Because essentially when you use a clickbaity title, you're saying that the content doesn't matter. Right now, maybe people are getting wise to it, sure, but still they're keeping on clicking.
Finally, look hard enough into any dark story and one can find occasional rays of light. Journalists here at Al Jazeera have been moved by the solidarity shown by other news outlets, many of them our direct competitors, over this network's Egyptian nightmare. We mentioned CNN earlier doing for Al Jazeera what we have been banned from doing, reporting the story on our own people from that courtroom in Cairo. Our Free AJ staff campaign has been retweeted more than 100,000 times by people who care. And exactly 24 hours after that verdict came down, many newsrooms, not just our own, fell silent with vigils to protest a judgment seen as a politically motivated attack on journalism in Egypt. Our gratitude for the support shown across our industry is outweighed only by our fears for our colleagues. We've compiled some images from those vigils in newsrooms in places as diverse as London, Tunis, and Stockholm. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.